Welcome back, AP Macro friends, to the third of our 8 AP Daily Live review sessions. I'm Jen Rayfields. I'm an AP Economics teacher at Ridgewood High School in Ridgewood, New Jersey, and it is my great pleasure to be working with you on these review sessions. So let's see what we've got on tap for this session. So you'll remember from our last session that there are 4 big ideas in AP Macroeconomics that are spiraled in across multiple units of the course, and they are listed here on our slide. So today we're going to be talking about markets and the macroeconomic models that we use in order to illustrate what happens in markets. We did economic measurement in our last session, and in sessions 4, 5, and 6, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about those macroeconomic policies. So here's what's on tap specifically. We want to review those markets and the models we use to depict them. We're going to be talking about equilibrium and disequilibrium in the product market model. Then we'll take a quick review of money market, loanable funds market, and Forex graphs. We're going to talk about how do we draw them, how do we correctly label them, and how do we use them. But that's going to be a quick review, because where we're going to spend most of our time in this session is all of the different ways we can model the economy as a whole. So we'll spend some time with the ADAS model. We'll talk about shifters of aggregate demand, short run and long run aggregate supply. We'll talk about demand shocks, supply shocks, output gaps, and the long run self-adjustment. That always gives kids a bit of a hard time. So we'll spend some time there. And then we want to be able to represent long run equilibrium or either type of output gap using any one of these models for the macroeconomy. So we'll look at how do we show an output gap in the Phillips curve model, in the production possibilities curve, in our business cycle, and aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And then we are going to do a lot of practice. There are a lot of practice questions in this review session. So most of the questions that we look at are either going to rely on graphs as part of the answer, or what we're going to do is a lot of multiple choice questions where we get to look at how to use graphs to help us find the right answer. So we're definitely focusing on skill category 4, which is our graphing skill. So let's warm up with a couple of practice questions. So again, whenever you see that blue pause button, go ahead and pause your video and try to answer the question. I'll give you a second to do that. Okay, so hopefully you remember that in our first session, we talked about simultaneous changes in demand and supply in a product market. Same approach in this graph. So we have aggregate supply, aggregate demand, we have simultaneous changes. So first we'll graph the change in aggregate demand, and we'll isolate the effect of that change on price level and real output. So price level is rising, so is real output. Now let's graph our aggregate change in aggregate supply and see the effect of that on price level and real output. So what do you notice? Real output definitely going to increase, price level moving in opposite directions. So the change in the price level is indeterminate. So again, use a systematic approach to dealing with simultaneous changes, graph one, then the other, and then use that little record keeping system to answer the question. All right, so let's review. So we are going to start with that basic product market model that we learn about in Unit 1, and I bring up the big idea as it's listed in the course and exam description. Competitive markets bring together buyers and sellers to exchange goods and services for mutual gain. And the simple model of supply and demand, which we're going to review in a second, can be applied to different market contexts, which is then where we're going to spend the rest of our time. I highlighted mutual gain because if we understand that people behave in ways to make themselves as well off as they can, that is going to help us understand this concept of equilibrium. All right, so here is our basic product market model, and we're exploring the relationship between the price of a good in dollars and the quantity of that good. So we start with our downward sloping demand curve, which shows us that there's an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded by buyers. Then we have our upward sloping supply curve that shows us there's a positive or direct relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. Regardless of what market we're looking at, whether it's the money market, the loanable funds market, the market of the economy as a whole, the upward sloping curve tells us there's a positive or direct relationship, and the downward sloping curve shows us there's a negative or inverse relationship. Equilibrium is achieved at the price where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Markets achieve equilibrium when no one has an incentive to change what they're doing. Market forces, in other words, have come to rest. All right, so now let's take a look at what the course and exam description says about models. Macroeconomic models are simplified representations. They are simplifications. They represent the basic economic relationships and can be used to predict and explain how those relationships are affected by economic shocks. So it's almost impossible to talk about economics without using models to illustrate what's happening in the various contexts in which we use them. So we're going to review some of the market models, but then again, we're going to spend most of our time looking at those models for the entire economy. And the reason I think this is a good exercise to do as you start really getting into your review for the AP exam is because the skillful use of models, whether it's in a multiple choice question or in a free response question, is going to allow you to demonstrate your understanding. And again, that is the whole goal of the test. You've spent either all semester or all year working hard to learn the language of economics, to learn about the economy as a whole. And so the point of the test is to give you a chance to show all of that. If you can think very systematically about the tools of economic analysis, that's going to allow you to do a better job demonstrating everything that you've learned. And that's what we all want for you. All right. Again, tonight we're focusing on skill category 4, which is broken up into 3 parts. I don't think it's that important for you to be able to recognize which graphing skill you're exercising at any given time, but I do think it's worth thinking about what these 3 graphing skills are. 4A, can you draw a correctly labeled graph? So axes, curves, equilibrium, or points of interest. 4B, can you use the graph to show a specific economic situation? And that's what we're going to spend some time working on tonight. And then third, can you demonstrate the effect of a change in an economic situation on an accurately labeled graph or visual? So if we understand all 3 of these skills, we can be a little bit more thoughtful about making sure we're going through each step in our graphing process. All right, so as a reader, as a longtime AP economics teacher, I implore you to use a systematic approach to graphing. So what that means is develop a system for rendering each model and do it the same way every single time, right? You want it to become automatic. You want your brain power focused on how to use the model in the context of the question being asked, not what goes on the vertical axis again? What's the downward sloping curve labeled? You want that to be automatic. And so if you practice it in a systematic way, it's going to be very easy for you to use it on the exam. On the 2021 FRQs, and I looked at both sets, 7 of the 30 points in the free response question were graphing points. That's almost 25% of the FRQ for graphing. So ACE your graphs. This is the mnemonic device I teach my students. A stands for axes. Make sure that you have correct axes labels. C stands for curves. So use your standard curve abbreviations. I recommend that my students write out the axis labels in words, but that they always use the standard abbreviation for the curves. Otherwise, the model just gets too messy. Your equilibrium points or points of interest. Take a look at your graph. Have you identified equilibrium in a market, or have you identified the point you're being asked about in one of our other models? So E stands for equilibrium point or other points of interest. And then after you're done, if you're using the graph to show the effect of a change, go back and make sure you aced your graph. That D stands for directional arrows. When you see show the effect of a change in your direction in the FRQ, go back and make sure that you have directional arrows indicating whether or not that variable you're being asked about is going up or down, left or right. So here's a few more tips. Draw large, legible graphs. And I'm going to say pretty please. As a reader, I actually bought my first pair of reading glasses at my very first AP macroeconomics reading, in part because there were some postage-sized graphs in the question that I was scoring. There's 2 reasons. One, of course, it's going to make it easier for your reader, but for you, it'll make it easier for you to tell if something is missing. I can promise you that the smaller the graphs I was reading, the more likely there was to be a mistake. It's very easy to leave off a new curve label or a directional arrow or a new equilibrium point if your graph is really small. So small models make it hard to make sure you've done everything right. The other recommendation is, and I know it's hard to do because you feel very pressured for time, but if you can, read the whole prompt first. That way, you know, okay, I have to shift my aggregate demand curve to the left. That means I need to leave enough room along my horizontal axis to show a new lower quantity. So if you read the whole prompt, you know where you're going and you know how to set your graph up to give you room to do it. And then finally, my last tip is keep your axes labels out of the way. And so you'll see in the way that I've produced the graphs for this video, my axes labels are always either up to the top and to the left for the vertical axis or down and to the right for the horizontal axis, because I want to keep my axes clear to show my points of interest. All right, so these are my graphing pro tips. Develop a system. We're going to go through, with one exception, I think we're going to look at every single graph or model in the course tonight. All right, so here we go. Let's start with the other markets. So the money market, the loanable funds market, and the foreign exchange market, not the subject of tonight's video. We went through Forex markets in session 1. They'll come back again when Mr. Romano is here. But the money market and the loanable funds market, that's sessions 4 and 5. Mr. Romano is going to spend a lot of time with you on those markets. So for now, this is just let's look at correctly labeled graphs of each of these 3. So we'll start in the money market. So the money market is short-term borrowing. We're making decisions that are not affected by the inflation rate. And so we care about the nominal interest rate in the context of the money market. We're borrowing for such a short period of time that we are not, the effects of inflation are not relevant to our decision. That's why we use the nominal interest rate. So we have a downward sloping money demand curve. And in this graph, to represent the control over the monetary base, we indicate that the money supply is vertical or independent of the nominal interest rate. So in this model, we represent the supply of money vertical. So the symbol that you can use for nominal interest rate is a little lowercase I. That is not as important as getting that nominal interest rate right. So interest rate, quantity of money, symbol for nominal interest rate, and then indicate the quantity of money on the horizontal axis. When you shift the money supply curve, you see the directional arrow showing that the money supply curve is shifting to the right. Then we have a new lower equilibrium nominal interest rate and a new higher equilibrium quantity of money, all 3 arrows. Let's turn our attention to the loanable funds market. So as you've learned in class, the loanable funds market represents the market for real borrowing. This is where people are making much longer term decisions. And so they care much more about the real interest rate, which includes a consideration of inflation. So we use the real interest rate on the vertical axis. We use the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis, downward sloping demand for loanable funds, upward sloping supply of loanable funds, and equilibrium real interest rate at where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. If we wanted to show an increase in the demand for loanable funds, let's say, for example, due to government borrowing, we would shift the demand curve to the right using a directional arrow. And then we would show that that causes the real equilibrium interest rate to rise and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds to rise as well. Now, I want to point out that a variety of textbooks may treat the axes labels in the money market and the loanable funds market different from the way it's depicted here. The important thing is that you recognize it's an interest rate, and there is an appendix in the course and exam description for AP Macro that lists all of the models that you need to know. And this is the way that they are labeled in that appendix. So this is the way I'm showing it to you. Nominal interest rate, short-term borrowing in the money market, real interest rate, long-term borrowing in the loanable funds market. Now let's go to the exchange rate. So in the foreign exchange market, remember the vertical axis is the relative price of the currency. We're looking at the price of a given currency in terms of another currency. In this case, I'm just putting the exchange rate for the dollar in a foreign exchange graph for the dollar. So if you're using a fraction or a ratio in your vertical axis, make sure that the symbol in the denominator matches the quantity that you're including. So in this case, it's the exchange rate for the dollar relative to the quantity of the dollar. That's what we're looking at in this graph. Downward sloping demand for the dollar, upward sloping supply for the dollar, and then our equilibrium exchange rate and equilibrium quantity. So if we wanted to show an increase in the supply of the dollar, for example, if people want to buy more foreign goods and services, they have to supply currency into the foreign exchange market in order to buy another currency. That is going to cause the equilibrium exchange rate to fall. In other words, the dollar will depreciate. So again, you should see a lot of things in common across each of these three models. We have downward sloping demand curves. We have upward sloping or vertical supply curves. Our axes, our curves, our equilibrium points are all labeled, and we have directional arrows to indicate the direction in which one of the curves is shifting. And then along the axes, we want to use our arrows to show what happens to the variable on the vertical axis and the variable on the horizontal axis. All right, so there's our market models. Now let's go to aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We're going to spend a little more time on this one. So remember that that horizontal axis is real GDP, which is analogous to aggregate output. Real GDP is the value in dollars of the aggregate output of an economy. So keep in mind, all else equal, a change in real GDP is accompanied by a change in employment. If we are increasing the amount of real GDP we're producing, we have to hire more workers. The unemployment rate falls. So whatever's happening to real GDP, we can determine what's happening to the unemployment rate as well. It's also equal to aggregate spending, which is the sum of consumer spending, firm investment spending, government spending, and exports minus imports. So real GDP equals aggregate output, equals aggregate spending, and it equals aggregate income. If you're asked, what is the effect of a change in income on something, you want to think, oh, we're producing more goods and services. If you're asked for the effect of a change in aggregate demand on aggregate income, remember, real GDP using the expenditures approach is C plus I plus G plus net X. In the income approach, it's wages plus rent plus interest plus profits. So never forget that all of that information is on your horizontal axis. Okay, so the horizontal axis measures the change in aggregate output, tells us what's happening to aggregate spending, aggregate income, and the unemployment rate. If there's any one thing I would want you to get out of this video is that changes in real GDP are accompanied by changes in the unemployment rate and also mean there's a change in national income. On that vertical axis, we're looking at the aggregate price level, which can be and is usually the GDP deflator. But what is important to remember is that this is not actually the inflation rate. The aggregate price level is a measure of what's happening to prices, but we would need to use aggregate price levels and our rate of change formula to determine what's happening to the actual inflation rate. So save your inflation rate for other models. This is the aggregate price level. Usually, again, we're thinking about the GDP deflator. So we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate demand, aggregate supply achieves short run equilibrium at the price level where the quantity of aggregate output demanded is equal to the quantity of short run aggregate output supplied. We use that symbol Y. Remember, Y is the symbol for income. So we use that symbol Y to help us remember whatever's happening to real GDP is also happening to aggregate income. All right, so that's the model. So now let's review our, what do we need to know about the aggregate demand curve? Well, we have to remember that it tells us about the inverse relationship between the price level and the quantity of aggregate output demanded. We always want to remember, are we looking at a change in the quantity of aggregate output demanded, which is a movement along the curve, or are we looking at a change in aggregate demand, which is a shift of the curve? So there's three reasons for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. If you want to learn more about them, go back to that 3.1 video in AP Classroom. What are our shifters of aggregate demand? Well, since aggregate demand means is the sum of consumer demand, firm demand, and net exports, an autonomous change, right? That means independent of something, independent of income in this case, an autonomous change in consumption, gross private domestic investment, exports or imports, that's going to shift aggregate demand. We've learned about fiscal policy by this point in the course. So a change in government spending on goods and services or a change in taxes or transfers will also shift the aggregate demand curve. And of course, you've also learned about the effect of monetary policy on aggregate demand. So a change in interest rates is going to influence the aggregate demand curve as well. Those are our shifters. So one thing I want to remind you of, if consumption, gross private domestic investment, or government spending and exports go up, aggregate demand increases. But if imports go up, aggregate demand goes down. So don't forget that inverse relationship. Now let's quickly review short-run aggregate supply. It's upward sloping, indicates there's a positive or direct relationship between the price level and the quantity of aggregate output supplied in the short run, right? Higher price level, firms increase the quantity of aggregate output supplied. Lower price level, firms decrease the quantity of aggregate output supplied. Remember that the reason for this is because of that concept of sticky input prices or sticky wages. Changes in that word sticky means input prices don't respond to changes in the price level as quickly as output prices do. So wage and other input price changes lag behind changes in the price level. That's the definition of sticky input prices. So what are the shifters of short-run aggregate supply? Well, anything that makes it cheaper and easier to produce is going to change the quantity of short-run aggregate output supplied. So a change in input costs like wages, or commodity prices like energy, increases in productivity, like a technological advance or an increase in human capital. And then, of course, there are some government policies that you learn about in Unit 5 that can affect short-run aggregate supply as well. So these are our shifters of SRAS. And don't forget that inflationary expectations is an important determinant of short-run aggregate supply too. All else equal, if firms expect to be able to get a higher price level for their goods in the future, they're going to decrease short-run aggregate supply today. If they expect the price level to fall in the future, they're going to try to sell more while the price level is high. So increase in inflationary expectations, SRAS shifts left, decrease in inflationary expectations, SRAS shifts right. And finally, don't confuse a change in wages with a change in income. And of course, you're absolutely right. If wages rise, that tends to mean that households have more income. That makes total logical sense. But in some ways, these are like code words. If you see wages, we want to understand it from the firm side. If you see income, then we want to understand it from the demand side. So change in wages shifts SRAS, change in income shifts aggregate demand. All right, now let's take a look at the last curve in the model, then we'll be ready to use it. Long run aggregate supply, independent of the price level. That's what that vertical line means. In the long run, we can produce any quantity of aggregate output. We can produce our full employment levels of output at any price level. That's what that vertical line means. Full employment level of output, the amount of real GDP we can produce with all of our resources employed, is independent of the price level. It's a function of the nation's capital stock. So LRAS represents the productive capacity of the economy and therefore its potential output. So what are the things, and remember in the long run, wages and other input prices are fully flexible. So in the short run, firms can exploit changes in the price level, but in the long run, which is defined as the time period in which all input prices are flexible, we can produce our full employment level of output at any price level. So the shifters of LRAC are the same factors that cause the PPC to shift out. So if we find more resources, if we get more workers, if we have some kind of change in productivity that allows us to get more output per worker, those are the things that are going to shift long run aggregate supply. In session 6, when we talk about economic growth, we'll take a look at some of the policies that can affect long run aggregate supply too. All right. One thing to keep in mind for now, we'll go through output gaps, but one thing to keep in mind, if we have a productivity change that increases short run aggregate supply, if those changes become permanent, long run aggregate supply is going to shift too. So we'll look at that in a little more detail right up next. So now let's really quickly go through the different types of shocks that an economy can experience and that long run self-adjustment process. So a demand shock is an autonomous change in aggregate demand. A positive demand shock causes aggregate demand to increase, which is represented in the model as a shift of the curve to the right. So at our initial price level here at PL1, the quantity of aggregate output demanded is greater than the quantity of aggregate output supplied. That creates our shortage, which is eliminated through rising prices. We end up at a new short run equilibrium at PL2 and Y2. So now think about it. If we're in an inflationary gap, that means we're producing beyond full employment levels of output. That means that we are outside of our PPC. Because Y is greater than Y2 is greater than YF, we're in that inflationary gap. So think about connect the inflationary gap to the utilization and employment of resources. In order to produce beyond full employment levels of output, we have to employ more resources. But at this point now, our actual unemployment rate is going to be below the natural rate of unemployment. And so eventually, as those wage and other input price agreements expire and prices become flexible, the prices of those inputs is going to rise. That's going to cause our short run aggregate supply to shift to the left and restore the economy to long run equilibrium. So see the arrow, output goes back to YF, but we arrive at a new higher price level. So that's a positive demand shock and a long run self-adjustment. So here's a negative demand shock. We have a decrease in aggregate demand that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left at our original equilibrium price level. Now we have a surplus. That surplus is eliminated through falling prices. We end up at a new short run equilibrium price and level of output. And since Y2 is less than YF, that means we're in a recessionary gap. So for the long run adjustment process, if we're in a recessionary gap with a current output less than potential output, that means our actual unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment. We have unemployed resources. So eventually the prices of those unemployed resources is going to fall. As input prices and wages fall, short run aggregate supply is going to increase. As it does so, we're going to end up at a new long run equilibrium. And we're going to end up back at our long run equilibrium with a new lower price level. So there's our negative demand shock and our long run self-adjustment. Let's take a look at a negative supply shock. Supply shocks are a little bit harder for students to manage, so we'll go through these. So a negative supply shock is going to cause short run aggregate supply to decrease, which is represented in the model as a shift of the curve to the left. Remember, at our current price level, at our original equilibrium price level, that is going to create a shortage because of the decrease in short run aggregate supply. That shortage is going to be eliminated through rising prices. And now we end up at a short run equilibrium at PL2 and Y2. Even though the price level rose as a result of this supply shock, and yes, I'm sure you recognize this is stagflation. We have rising inflation rates and rising unemployment rates. But what defines this as a recessionary gap is the fact that Y2 is less than YF. So the long run self-adjustment process is going to be the same as even as a demand shock. Because we're in a recessionary gap, eventually those input prices will fall, and that's going to cause short run aggregate supply to increase. And we end up back at our long run equilibrium full employment level of output and back at the price level where we started. So that's the mechanism for a long run self-adjustment in response to a negative supply shock. Now let's take a look at two things that can happen in response to a positive supply shock. So positive supply shock, I bet you're going to anticipate correctly, that's going to increase short run aggregate supply at our original equilibrium price level. Now we have a surplus. That surplus is going to be eliminated through falling prices. We end up at our short run equilibrium at PL2 and Y2. We're in an inflationary gap because Y2 is greater than YF. Now, if the factors that caused that short run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, let's say it was a change in some kind of production tax or something, if that doesn't stay, if that goes away, we haven't permanently changed the amount of output we can produce. So we had a short run increase in output. We're producing beyond our PPC, and we're going to end up following the long run self-adjustment process for an inflationary gap. Resources are overemployed. In the long run, those wages and input prices are going to rise. Short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left, and we're going to end up back at our equilibrium price level and long run equilibrium level of output. Now, what if the factors that cause that increase in short run aggregate supply are actually permanent? Well, what that means is we've increased the productive capacity of the economy. And so in the long run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right, and we'll end up at a new higher level of real GDP that we can produce at full employment. Okay. All right. So now that we've reviewed that model, we are ready to, and we've explored output gaps, the meaning of output gaps. Now we're ready to review all of the different ways we can model output gaps in AP macroeconomics. We're going to look at the PPC, the business cycle model. We'll quickly review ADAS and then the Phillips curve model too. So here we go. Correctly drawn and labeled PPC models. We're going to use axes, curves, and equilibrium or other points of interest. So for now, here's a correctly labeled graph of a macroeconomic PPC, capital goods on one axis, consumer goods on the other, tend to see increasing opportunity costs at the economy-wide level. And then we label the curve. Let's say this is country A's PPC. We could also draw a PPC that has constant opportunity costs. Let's say we're looking at two goods X and good Y. If the resources are fully transferable or fully substitutable in the production of both goods, we'll have a constant opportunity cost. We might have some specific values in our graph, but here are two correctly drawn and labeled PPC models, one showing increasing opportunity cost, the other showing constant opportunity cost. Okay, so now if we wanted to use the PPC to show full employment, long run equilibrium, or an output gap, we use it by putting a point X relative to the production possibilities curve to indicate whether we're producing at long run equilibrium, producing less than long run equilibrium output. So correctly labeled axes, curves, and then use our point to indicate in long run equilibrium, we're producing a combination of consumer goods and capital goods that's on our PPC. If we're in a recessionary gap, we'll do the same thing. Axes, curves, and now if we're in a recessionary gap, we're producing less than full employment levels of an output. So we should draw a point inside our PPC. And you guessed it. If we're producing in an inflationary gap, that means we're producing beyond full employment levels of output, and we show that with a point outside the PPC. So that's it. That's how we use our PPC to show an output gap. Now, let's look at our ADAS model and showing full employment versus output gaps. So again, a systematic approach is going to serve you super well. Correctly labeled axes, we have the aggregate price level and real GDP, correctly labeled curves, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. And then the first thing we should do is find our current equilibrium output and price level, because to show an output gap, we want to show that our current output is different from our full employment levels of output. But if we're in long run equilibrium, it means our current output is equal to our full employment levels of output. So we're going to put our long run aggregate supply curve right there through the middle to show that current output is equal to potential output. So there's an economy in long run equilibrium. You might be told potential output is equal to current output. You might be told that the actual rate of unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. You want to be able to recognize long run equilibrium in a variety of different ways that it might be presented to you. So now let's take a look at these output gaps. So we'll do a recessionary gap in the graph on the left and an inflationary gap in the graph on the right. Draw and find your current price level and output first, and then indicate if it's a recession that our current output is less than our potential output. So there's potential output greater than current output. So that's how we show a recessionary gap. Then an inflationary gap, you guessed it, we're just going to put that long run aggregate supply curve to the left, indicating that our current output is greater than our potential output. All right, we're almost in the home stretch here in terms of a review, and then we can practice. So here's our business cycle model. Now you don't have to draw a business cycle model in this course, but you do have to be able to read and interpret them. So we have real GDP over time is our graph, and we have potential real GDP indicating that we want some steady, stable rate of growth, some steady rate at which real GDP is going to increase over time. But as you've learned, because of the business cycle, real GDP increases at faster rates, and then it increases at slower rates, and then sometimes it even decreases. So we have a business cycle. So if we're in long run equilibrium, that means current output or actual output is equal to potential output. So any point where the actual real GDP or current real GDP line intersects the potential real GDP line is a point where the economy is in long run equilibrium. So any one of those points would indicate long run equilibrium in the business cycle. In the business cycle model, we can show a recessionary gap by finding a point where our actual real GDP is less than our potential real GDP, like any of the 3 points that we have shown here. So if we are below our potential real GDP line, that means we're in a recessionary gap. We might be in the recessionary part of the business cycle. We might be in the trough. We might be in the expansionary phase. But the point is, if we're below potential real GDP, that's what means we're in a recessionary gap. All right, so the inflationary gap, you guessed it. If current output is greater than potential output, if actual real GDP is greater than potential real GDP, now we're showing an inflationary gap. Again, it doesn't matter if we're in the expansionary phase, the peak, or the contractionary or recessionary phase. What matters is if current output or actual real GDP is greater than potential, that's what means we're in the inflationary gap. Let's bring up the Phillips curve model, and this will be the last model in which we explore this concept, and then we'll be ready to practice. So as you've learned, the Phillips curve model shows us a curve that illustrates the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. We put the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. The short run Phillips curve is the downward sloping curve that tells us in the short run, there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the short run. So think about the short run Phillips curve as being the trade-off that exists at some expected rate of inflation. Depending on the context of the problem, I sometimes label my SRPC with the expected inflation rate, and that helps me use the model. The long run Phillips curve is a vertical line at the natural rate of unemployment. So you can use the symbol UN to indicate natural rate of unemployment. You could also use NRU, and in some models, it's NIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Regardless of how you label it, what you want to indicate is that the natural rate of unemployment is where the long run Phillips curve lies, and it's a vertical. And that shows that there's no trade-off in the long run. What does that mean? We can be in full employment, we can operate at the natural rate of unemployment at any rate of inflation in the long run. So when the economy is in long run equilibrium, what that means is the actual rate of inflation is equal to the expected rate of inflation. So this is how we would show, using the Phillips curve model, long run equilibrium. We would put a point X at the intersection to show that the current inflation rate is equal to the expected inflation rate. So we're in long run equilibrium here. So if we wanted to do this and show a recessionary gap, I think it helps a lot to focus on that unemployment rate axis. So again, we have the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So we have a short run Phillips curve showing us the short run trade-off. We bring up our long run Phillips curve to indicate that's the natural rate of unemployment. Well, if the economy is in a recessionary gap, that means our actual unemployment rate is higher than our natural rate of unemployment. So even though in the ADAS model, that's often shown with to the left, right? You'd have an equilibrium point to the left of long run equilibrium. In this graph, a higher unemployment rate along that horizontal axis shows you that the point to the right of the long run Phillips curve is how you would show your recessionary gap. So I think if you use that horizontal axis, it'll help you. Oh, well, if the actual rate of unemployment is higher, that point has to be to the right of the natural rate. And then the short run Phillips curve tells us what the inflation rate is going to be at that recessionary gap. If we want to draw, and then we label it with our point Y. If we want to draw an inflationary gap, we can use the same approach. So we have our inflation rate, our unemployment rate, our short run Phillips curve that's downward sloping, bring up your long run Phillips curve at the natural rate of unemployment. And now think about what that inflationary gap means. It means that our actual unemployment rate is less than our natural unemployment rate. So we want that current unemployment rate to be lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Then we can go up to our short run Phillips curve, use it to go over to the inflation rate axis, and that is how we can find the point that would show the economy in an inflationary gap. So this is an approach that I think will help you as you're using the Phillips curve if you have to model an output gap. All right, so that was a lot of review. Now we're going to practice. Graphing is a major component of the free response section of the exam, as we've already talked about, but there are so many MCQs that you can solve easily if you employ the right model when trying to answer the question. We saw that in our warm-up question. So you can and should use graphs when you're answering multiple choice questions as well. So let's practice doing that now. Here we go. Pause your video and see if you can use a graph to answer this question. How did you do? You bring up your graph, aggregate price level, real GDP, find your current level of output. And what we're being told is that we have an increase in inflation and unemployment. That means that our PL is rising and our Y is falling. So we find a new point with a higher price level and lower real GDP. The only thing that could have got us there is a decrease in short run aggregate supply. So now we know we're looking for a decrease, or something that's going to cause short run aggregate supply to decrease in our answer choices. So an increase in inflationary expectations, that's going to cause short run aggregate supply to shift to the left. Let's look at another one. Pause your video and use your graph. Here's another one of our simultaneous change in demand and supply questions. So we have a reduction in aggregate supply that causes if aggregate supply goes down, price level rises, output falls. If simultaneously aggregate demand rises, then we're going to see an increase in the price level and an increase in output. So we can see the price level is definitely rising and the change in output is indeterminate. Once we see that, D immediately pops up as the right answer. So again, use those graphs. Here's another one. This is a long run self-adjustment question. Pause your video. All right, we've got that recessionary gap. That means that we've got lots of unemployed resources. Eventually, the prices for those are going to fall. Short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. There we go. Let's do another one of these. How'd you do? Now we're in an inflationary gap. That means that wages and other input prices are going to increase. Short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. If you know what you're being asked about is this long run self-adjustment process, then that's what you're looking for in the answer choices. All of the other answer choices that aren't related to the change in input prices that results from the output gap, those are our answer choices that are designed to distract you. So go right for I know I'm in an inflationary gap. I know I'm looking for wages and or other input prices to rise. All right, I think this is our last multiple choice question. Use a graph. Okay, so long run equilibrium, we have a decrease in aggregate demand. Which of the following is going to be true in the short run? I look at my graph, I know that the level of output is falling. That means the unemployment rate is rising. That means actual unemployment is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. And because the price level is falling, I know inflation is falling. Once I know that, I can find the answer right there in the answer choices. So, we do have one more of these. This is one of those multi-part questions. Draw yourself a graph. So once you recognize this is causing aggregates of short run aggregate supply to increase, we show that by shifting the curve to the right, and then we just read our graph. We see the price level falls and real output rises. So hopefully you saw through those several questions that, as my very dear friend says, you're not too cool to graph. The more you mark up that test, the more you use the tools of economic analysis, the more easily you will be able to show that you understand this stuff. So please use your graphs on the multiple choice portion of the test. Now we're going to head into FRQs. So please pause your video, spend some time on this one. Okay, and then when you're all done, then come back and unpause it, and we'll see how you did. So I'll give you a second to pause. All right, so let's come back and we're going to go through these kind of systematically here. Make sure you got it. So we're starting with a correctly drawn and labeled graph. We've got aggregate price level, real GDP. We find our current equilibrium output and price level, and then we show we're in a recessionary gap. All right, so then the next part asks us to show what would happen in response to a change. And so we increase aggregate demand, show that by shifting it to the right. It's not telling us that this is a long run self-adjustment. We could close the gap. So if you brought your aggregate demand curve all the way back up to full employment levels of output, that would be absolutely correct. But we can show that we have a higher price level and a higher level of output. Aggregate demand shifts to the right, and that's what we've shown. Sometimes I record when I'm answering FRQs just to make sure that I hit all my points. I will make sure that my graph says what I think it should say. All right, so then part C. We have to show using a Phillips curve. So there's our short run Phillips curve. We have our current unemployment rate and our new unemployment rate. So our current unemployment rate is higher than our new unemployment rate, right? Because when YE goes to Y2, we have to hire more workers. So the unemployment rate is going to fall. So then we can find our point A at our first unemployment rate and point B at our new lower unemployment rate. And then we can just read the graph across. That helps us find our initial and subsequent inflation rates. So there's a correctly labeled graph of the Phillips curve showing the effect of the policy on the unemployment rate. Then the next question asks us about the real interest rate because of an increase in government borrowing. So there's the answer to part D. Now you could have shown it in a graph, right? You could have used a graph to show your answer to the question. Graph your supply and demand, use your real interest rate and your quantity of loanable funds, find your equilibrium real interest rate, and show the effect of government borrowing on the demand for loanable funds, which drives up the real interest rate. It is sometimes the case that the answer might not have all of the links in the chain. A correctly labeled graph that shows that the reason the real interest rate went up is because the government borrowing leads to an increase in the demand for loanable funds. That is your explanation. Obviously, if you're directed to explain, you want to do it in words, but if you have time to check yourself with a quick graph, it can absolutely help you. All right, then part E, we had to draw a production possibilities curve, and we have to show the effect of the policy on using the correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities curve. So we have military goods on the vertical axis, civilian goods on the horizontal axis. We show that it's a PPC. We have our initial point C, and then point D shows we're spending more on we're producing more military goods. I could certainly understand why kids might want to shift the PPC out because of the change in spending on military goods, but this is just a movement in the short run. We're moving from one combination of goods to another. Hopefully you did well on that. You worked well with all of your graphs. Let's go ahead and take a look at another one. All right, so here's our last one. You've got one more in you. I know you do. You're practicing. You want to do well on the exam. Go ahead and pause your video. All right, I actually think these questions with the numbers in them make the Phillips curve easier. So we are told that the economy has an actual unemployment rate of 7 and a natural unemployment rate of 5. Well, what does that mean to you? Right away, that means we are in a recessionary gap. Our current unemployment is higher than our natural rate. That means we have cyclical unemployment. So we have to use that knowledge to show where we are in the economy using the Phillips curve. Then we've got that self-correction again question, fiscal policy, and then we'll finish up the rest of it. So for part A, given the values above, we have a short run Phillips curve, a long run Phillips curve at 5%. That's our natural rate of unemployment. So if our actual rate of unemployment is 7, that's our current, that's where we are in our current Phillips curve. If the government takes no action, will the short run aggregate supply curve shift to the right, shift to the left, or remain the same? Well, we know if we're in a recessionary gap, the short run aggregate supply curve is eventually going to shift to the right because resources are underemployed. Now, the long run Phillips curve isn't going to change at all because changing quantities of output doesn't change the natural rate of unemployment. So that question is designed to see if you understand that. So there's no change in the long run Phillips curve. Okay, so if we wanted to use fiscal policy, we could either increase spending or decrease taxes. Those are our expansionary policies. And then for part D, now we have to draw our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, show the impact on the equilibrium price level of the fiscal policy. So the expansionary policy is designed to shift aggregate demand, is designed to increase aggregate demand, and that would make price level and output rise. And then for part E, we're asked, based on the change in real GDP, will the supply of country X's currency increase or decrease or remain the same? So for part E, it says, based on the change in real GDP identified in part D, will the supply of country X's currency in the foreign exchange market increase, decrease, or remain the same? So remember that the expansionary policy causes the price level to rise. That makes country X's domestically produced goods and services relatively more expensive than goods and services produced elsewhere. So that's going to cause people in country X to want to buy more goods and services from other countries. In order to do that, they have to supply more of their domestic currency into the foreign exchange market to be able to buy the foreign currencies that those imports are denominated in. So the supply of country X's currency in the Forex market is going to increase. Part F is based on the answer to part E. So assuming a flexible exchange rate, will country X's currency appreciate, depreciate, or remain the same in the foreign exchange market? Well, you probably know this without graphing it, but if the supply of the currency goes up, the exchange rate's going to fall. That means the currency is depreciating, but you can absolutely use a graph to reinforce it, make sure that's what's going on. So we have the demand and the supply of the currency. We have the equilibrium exchange rate, an increase in supply. There it is. That's going to cause the equilibrium exchange rate to fall. When the exchange rate falls, the currency is depreciating. So that is the answer to part F. And that brings us to the end of our practice session. So that was a lot, right? We went through the markets, we went through the models, we had several multiple choice questions, we had 3 full long FRQs. So after all of that work, what do we want to walk away from this review session keeping in mind? Market economies rely on markets and the price system to answer the big questions, right? What are we going to produce? How are we going to produce? And who's going to get it? Markets are a way of answering that question. They bring buyers and sellers together. In order to be able to describe, predict, and explain how buyers and sellers behave, economists use market models. In AP Macro, students want to be able to use the market for a specific good or service, the money market, the loanable funds market, and the foreign exchange market to describe the behavior of buyers and sellers or in different contexts. The models, right? Market models are one type of model that we learn how to use in this course. Models in general represent underlying economic behavior, and they're, again, tools used by economists. Remember, curves don't shift by themselves. Prices, quantities, equilibrium points, they don't change by themselves. Changes in underlying economic behavior That is what we are representing in these models. So always ask yourself, what is the behavior that's changing and whose behavior is captured by which curve? And that will help you use those models to answer the questions, especially about the macro economy. So we want to be able to use a variety of different types of models that focus on these big economic aggregates: GDP, income, employment, and inflation. You want to be comfortable and confident using any of the models listed below. The PPC, the ADAS model, and the Phillips curve model, those are the macroeconomic models you want to be able to draw and use in your free response questions. The other, the circular flow, the business cycle, and the aggregate production function, those are models that may show up in multiple choice questions. And if they don't show up there, you can certainly use them to help you answer multiple choice questions about those topics. So that is it for review session number 3. I will see you again in session 6, where we explore economic growth. And I want to thank you again so much for your time tonight. Take good care, everyone, and good luck on your exam.